Winter, 1942. Snow presses against the windows of a German headquarters somewhere deep in occupied Europe. Inside, the air smells of oil, tobacco, damp wool. Maps are pinned to the walls: Russia, North Africa. The Atlantic routes marked with fresh grease pencil strokes. Officers lean over the tables, confident. Orders are prepared. Timetables finalized. Entire divisions are already in motion. What they do not know is that the offensive unfolding in their minds has already been read, thousands of miles away. In quiet rooms with shaded lamps and locked doors, American analysts sift through strings of numbers, cold columns of data, radio intercepts pulled from the air, messages meant to be unbreakable, messages meant only for German eyes. The men planning these offensives believe in their machines, in encrypted rotors, in mathematical certainty, in the assumption that no enemy could possibly be listening this closely. Yet allied planners already know where the blow will fall, which units will advance, how much fuel is allocated, even the doubts hidden between formal lines. This is not a battlefield of guns or tanks. It is a war fought in silence. And when German commanders finally realized their secrets were exposed, the shock would ripple through the Axis war effort itself, just as the context for this unseen battle had already been set years earlier. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Germany entered the conflict with a deep and rational confidence in secrecy. It was not arrogance born of ideology alone, but trust in engineering. German military communications were wrapped in layers of encryption, protected by machines believed to be mathematically impregnable. At the center of that confidence sat the Enigma. Enigma was not a single device, but a family of machines. Each keystroke altered an internal wiring path, scrambling letters through rotating electrical circuits. Daily key changes multiplied the possibilities. To German planners, the mathematics appeared absolute. Even if a message was intercepted, decoding it without the precise settings would take longer than the war itself. This belief shaped behavior. Messages grew longer. Operational detail increased. Commanders used radio freely, even casually, convinced that speed now outweighed risk. The German armed forces began to treat the air itself as secure. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched Europe burn from a distance. In 1939 and 1940, American intelligence capabilities were modest and fragmented. Signals intelligence existed, but it lacked scale. Code-breaking was the domain of small units and underfunded departments. The U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service, housed at Fort Meade, worked quietly, without the prestige afforded to combat arms. The Navy ran its own parallel efforts, focused largely on Japanese communications in the Pacific. There was no unified intelligence doctrine, no central authority, and little expectation that encrypted Axis traffic could be exploited on a meaningful scale. That began to change as Europe fell. By 1940, German victories in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France exposed a new reality. Warfare was accelerating. Decisions were being made at unprecedented speed, and radio communication had become the bloodstream of modern armies. Every movement depended on signals. Every offensive left a faint trace in the electromagnetic spectrum. British intelligence recognized this first. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts had already begun assaulting Enigma with a mixture of mathematics, engineering, and operational insight. Early successes were fragile. Breaks came and went, but even partial access hinted at something revolutionary: an opportunity to see inside the enemy's decision-making process. The United States observed these efforts cautiously. At first from the outside, official neutrality limited cooperation, but information leaked through informal channels. Personal connections formed between British and American cryptographers. Both sides understood the stakes. If German communications could be read consistently, entire campaigns could be shaped before they began. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 erased hesitation overnight. Within weeks, code-breaking shifted from a peripheral effort to a strategic priority. Budgets exploded. Personnel flooded in: mathematicians, linguists, engineers, chess champions, statisticians. Men and women who would never wear uniforms would soon be determining where armies lived or died. Washington began constructing an intelligence infrastructure at speeds usually reserved for manufacturing tanks or aircraft. New facilities appeared in Maryland, Virginia, and Ohio. Monitoring stations stretched across the continent and onto remote Pacific islands. Radio intercepts were no longer isolated events. They became a continuous stream. Crucially, cooperation with Britain transformed into formal integration. Encrypted walls fell. Techniques were shared. Machines were replicated. The United States did not need to reinvent Enigma breaking from nothing. It expanded, industrialized, and sustained it. Meanwhile, German high command remained unaware of the scale forming against them. Security reviews inside the Wehrmacht repeatedly concluded that Enigma remained unbroken. Occasional hints convoys rerouted too efficiently. U-boats ambushed with uncanny precision were explained away as chance, betrayal, or superior enemy reconnaissance. The idea that the core cipher had failed was too disruptive to accept. So the traffic continued. German operational messages crossed the airwaves in measurable rhythms. Supply request, unit movements, weather forecasts, even pre-offensive reconnaissance summaries. Each transmission added data points. Patterns emerged. Once fragments were aligned, entire operational intentions could be reconstructed. By early 1942, the United States was no longer merely learning how the Axis communicated. It was beginning to understand how the Axis thought. That growing insight would soon move intelligence from observation into direct influence, setting the conditions for exposures that German commanders never believed possible. By mid-1942, American code-breaking had crossed a critical threshold. What had once been sporadic success hardened into routine access. The flow of decrypted material increased not linearly, but exponentially. Every solved key made the next one easier. Every known phrase, every habitual signature, every predictable report shortened the gap between interception and comprehension. Inside secure live facilities, this intelligence was given carefully sanitized names. MAGIC for Japanese diplomatic and naval decrypts. Ultra for German and Italian military communications, shared under the strictest secrecy. The words themselves concealed their importance. Even most field commanders were never told where the information came from, only that it was reliable beyond question. This secrecy created a strange dual reality. On the surface, Allied staffs behaved like any other, studying reconnaissance photographs, questioning prisoners, planning within the limits of uncertainty. Beneath that surface, however, lay near real-time insight into Axis intentions. Offensive dates, fuel shortages, reinforcement delays, arguments inside enemy headquarters. The Atlantic became the first proving ground. German U-boat commanders reported position, weather, torpedo inventory, and intended patrol routes by radio. These reports were meant to coordinate wolf packs and maximize kill zones. Instead, they mapped the undersea war for Allied analysts. Convoys were rerouted moments before attack. Hunter-killer groups sailed directly to predicted intercept points. Losses that German commanders attributed to enemy luck or radar were, in reality, guided by decrypted instructions meant only for U-boat eyes. Yet even here, the Allies walked carefully. Reading the enemy's mail was only valuable if the enemy never realized it. Every response had to appear plausible. Convoys could not dodge too early. Escorts could not converge too perfectly. This self-restraint cost lives, but it preserved the larger advantage. Intelligence officers learned to think like novelist editors, changing as little as possible, so the story still felt real to its original author. In North Africa, the scale of influence grew even clearer. Axis forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel depended on long supply lines across the Mediterranean. Fuel shipments, ammunition convoys, and reinforcement schedules flowed through Italian naval channels and through Enigma. Decrypts revealed when ships sailed, what they carried, and how heavily they were escorted. Allied aircraft and submarines waited not in search patterns, but in ambush. Rommel fought with extraordinary tactical skill, but he fought blind. His request for fuel went unanswered not because Rome ignored him, but because the fuel never arrived. His planned offensive stalled not due to miscalculation, but because Allied planners already knew when and where they would begin. Still, German command interpreted these failures within familiar frameworks: poor coordination, inferior Italian performance, enemy material superiority. No single disaster pointed obviously to a compromised cipher. Across the world, U.S. codebreakers were applying the same principles in the Pacific. Japanese naval and diplomatic traffic provided glimpses into strategic debates and operational timing. Intelligence did not replace combat, but it shaped its terms. The war increasingly unfolded along paths already sketched in decoding rooms weeks earlier. By late 1942, something unprecedented had occurred in modern warfare. One side was planning its major actions while the other side was, quietly and systematically, reading those plans in advance. German commanders sensed something was wrong, but not what. After action reports began showing repeated coincidences, minefields where none were expected, air attacks timed to logistical movements, defensive concentrations waiting calmly at the exact points of advance. Statistically, these events should not have aligned so often. Yet abandoning Enigma would have meant more than switching machines. It would have meant admitting that the technological foundation of German command and control had failed. It would have meant accepting that the enemy knew their intentions, sometimes better than subordinate units did. For an organization structured around certainty and control, that possibility was intolerable. So doubts were filed away. Confidence persisted, and operational traffic continued to pour into Allied decoding centers. By the time German commanders began to openly question how the enemy appeared so prepared, Allied intelligence had already become a silent partner in nearly every major offensive decision, setting the stage for moments when coincidence hardened into undeniable shock, and the hidden angles of this intelligence war began to reveal themselves. Angle 1. The human distance between front lines and reading rooms to war most soldiers experienced was one of mud, noise, and immediacy. Shells fell. Engines roared. Orders arrived late or incomplete. From men in foxholes or tank turrets, uncertainty was constant, but far from the front. Another kind of wartime existence unfolded in windowless rooms guarded by armed sentries. Young Americans sat at desks for shifts that often stretched beyond 12 hours. Many were in their early 20s. Some had never seen Europe. Others had never fired a weapon. What they handled instead were stacks of intercepts, raw radio traffic pulled from the air. Stripped of context, reduced to symbols, their work demanded patience rather than courage, creativity rather than aggression. A minor mistake could mislead an entire command. A correct insight might save thousands of lives without anyone ever knowing their names. These analysts did not celebrate victories. They passed conclusions upward, anonymously. Their successes could never be publicly claimed. If enemy commanders suspected betrayal or a broken code, the advantage would vanish. This created an unsettling moral distance. An intercepted message might describe a German battalion preparing to advance at dawn. Allied forces would adjust accordingly. When the battle came, casualties followed on both sides. The analyst who enabled the ambush would never hear the sounds, never see the aftermath. Only a typed report would confirm that his interpretation had been accurate. German commanders could not conceive of this distance. They assessed the enemy through visible actions, air superiority, material output, troop movements. The idea that their operational intent was being weighed by individuals who neither wore medals nor issued orders lay outside traditional models of warfare. This mismatch shaped German reactions. When attacks failed, blame moved laterally or downward, never outward toward the possibility of unseen observers embedded in the electromagnetic space above the battlefield. That disconnect would grow increasingly costly. At the heart of the German failure was not blind faith, but misplaced trust in process. Enigma was not static. German engineers continuously improved it. New rotors increased complexity. Procedures were refined. Operators were trained to follow strict protocols. To German cryptographic officers, these changes confirmed security. Each added layer reinforced the belief that no outsider could keep pace. What they underestimated was not Allied ingenuity alone, but Allied scale. American code-breaking transformed cryptanalysis into an industrial endeavor. Rotors were rebuilt in replica. Sorting devices multiplied. Early electromagnetic machines, ancestors of modern computers, were adapted to scan possibilities. At unprecedented speed, work was distributed across teams. No single mind carried the burden alone. More importantly, cryptanalysis was paired with operational intelligence. Analysts did not treat messages as abstract puzzles. They studied habits. They tracked who sent what, when, and under which conditions. Message headers revealed organizational structure. Repeated phrases betrayed standard reporting procedures. Security, from the German perspective, focused on whether Enigma could be mathematically solved in theory. Allied success depended on whether it could be solved in practice quickly enough to matter. Often, it was. German commanders continued to transmit messages under time pressure, unaware that urgency itself was their enemy. Misstepped indicators, reused settings, compressed reporting styles intended to save seconds on the air, all of it fed the analytical machine. On the other side, in German doctrine, technology was meant to remove uncertainty. In reality, it had created a predictable system, and predictable systems, once mapped, can be penetrated repeatedly still. None of this felt visible at the front. Tanks still fought tanks. Planes still bombed cities. The idea that entire offensives were compromised before they began remained inconceivable. Yet this technological illusion, confidence built on complexity, formed only one layer of the problem. The deeper shock would emerge through leadership decisions, operational misjudgments, and the enemy's growing inability to explain failure. Angles that now demand closer examination. As patterns of failure accumulated, German field commanders quietly raised concerns. Reports moved upward, noting Allied reactions that appeared too precise. Defenses thickened at unanticipated points. Convoys vanished despite changing routes. Airstrikes arrived with unsettling punctuality. At the highest levels of German leadership, these concerns met resistance. Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht operated within a culture that prized technological superiority and centralized control. Enigma had been approved, maintained, and vouched for by specialists. Questioning it suggested either incompetence or betrayal. Neither explanation fit comfortably into the regime's self-image. Instead, blame turned inward. Suspected leaks, treachery among allies, weak discipline among operators. In some cases, this paranoia led to arrests and executions, but never to the conclusion that the core system had failed. This resulted in a strategic paradox. German leaders tightened control just as flexibility was required. Radio discipline increased, but message volume did not fall. Commanders centralized decision-making further, which required even more communication. The very effort to restore control deepened exposure. Some officers quietly altered habits, others limited detail, but no unified shift occurred. There was no moment when command declared communications fundamentally compromised. Without that admission, adaptation remained piecemeal. Leadership denial became a force multiplier for the enemy. From the German point of view, the enemy seemed strangely omnipresent. Allied forces appeared not merely reactive, but anticipatory. Defensive belts materialized where thrusts were planned. Forces arrived already prepared for assaults that had not yet revealed themselves. It was as though terrain itself had turned hostile. Yet German intelligence evaluations continued to rate Allied commanders as cautious and methodical, hardly omniscient. This contradiction fueled confusion. How could an enemy deemed conservative avoid surprise so consistently? The obvious explanation: superior reconnaissance was insufficient. Aerial photography could not reveal intent before movement. Radar could not explain strategic foresight weeks in advance. Espionage networks capable of such reach did not exist at scale. The result was a fog of misinterpretation. German commanders increasingly believed they faced an adversary blessed with uncanny luck. Failures were chalked up to coincidence repeating itself improbably. Patterns were observed, then dismissed. Each individual failure had a rational explanation. Together, they formed something far more disturbing. Perhaps most unsettling was how intelligence allowed the Allies to win without constant engagement. Decrypts did not always lead to attacks. Often, they enabled avoidance. Convoys simply vanished from predicted paths. Bombers struck empty airfields minutes after squadrons had been relocated. Defenses shifted silently. This deprived the Axis of feedback. When no battle occurred, no lessons were learned. German planners refined tactics based on encounters that never happened, while the real struggle unfolded beyond detection. Warfare had entered a phase where power lay not only in destruction, but in denial of contact, of surprise, of initiative. German commanders sensed their grip slipping, but not why. And as the war approached its most decisive offensives, the cumulative weight of these angles began converging toward moments where secrecy collapsed entirely, not through confession, but through undeniable consequence. By early 1943, the gap between German intent and German results had become impossible to ignore at the operational level. In the Atlantic, U-boat losses reached levels that defied precedent. Entire patrols failed to return. Wolf packs assembled precisely where convoys did not sail. Once lethal killing grounds grew silent. Reports from submarine commanders described an enemy that seemed to anticipate presence before a single wake was spotted. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence officers followed the rhythm of German naval communications with near precision. Enigma decrypts revealed patrol zones, refueling plans, rendezvous points, even mechanical issues delaying individual submarines. This knowledge allowed Allied escort groups to abandon defensive formations and hunt with intent. The effect on German command was acute. Admiral Karl Dönitz reviewed loss reports that made strategic sense only on paper. He knew Allied production was increasing. He knew new technologies, such as radar and long-range aircraft, were entering service. But the correlation between German radio traffic and Allied response grew harder to rationalize. Yet even here, Enigma itself remained untouched in internal assessments. At the same time, in North Africa, the consequences of exposed planning culminated visibly. After the U.S. defeat at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German commanders expected hesitation. Instead, they encountered rapid Allied reorganization, reinforced positions, and carefully timed counterstrokes. Rommel's subsequent offensives found defenses prepared in depth. Fuel shortages worsened. Axis forces attacked where Allied reserves already waited. British and American units appeared less improvisational and far more informed. Decrypted Axis messages had revealed logistical fragility. Allied air power targeted shipping at precisely the moments Rommel most desperately needed resupply. By the time Axis commanders realized their offensive momentum had stalled, the window had already closed. In Sicily, the pattern repeated, this time on an even larger stage. As Axis leaders prepared for an Allied invasion somewhere in the Mediterranean, Intercepted communications betrayed confusion and indecision. German and Italian commands disagreed on likely landing zones. Requests for reinforcements crossed the air in plain procedural formats, readable once keys were solved. When Allied forces landed in July 1943, German commanders reacted with urgency but not surprise. Defensive plans unfolded swiftly. Coordination relied on communication systems already fully mapped by Allied intelligence. Every hurried transmission deepened exposure. German officers on the ground began questioning how Allied forces repositioned so quickly, how reserves appeared at exactly the right intersections, how air attacks synchronized with ground advances without obvious delays. These were not isolated failures. They were symptoms of a system in which the enemy understood sequence, timing, and limitation better than those issuing the orders. Inside German headquarters, the tone shifted not toward clarity, but toward anxiety. Unexplained loss breeds suspicion. Yet suspicion without evidence turns inward. Security investigations multiplied. Operators were retrained. Procedures tightened. Still, the pattern did not break, because the problem was not carelessness. It was structural. As the war moved toward its defining confrontation in Western Europe, the Axis prepared once more, this time expecting deception, surprise, and misdirection. What they could not accept was that the deception they feared was no longer necessary. Their plans were already known, and soon, the consequences of that knowledge would reach a point where coincidence could no longer plausibly explain the outcome. By 1944, the war had entered a phase where German commanders no longer spoke of surprise as something they expected to achieve, but something they desperately tried to deny the enemy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the months leading to the Allied invasion of Western Europe. German leadership knew an invasion was coming. That much was obvious. What they did not know, despite thousands of intercepted messages of their own, was precisely when and where it would fall. This blindness was not accidental. It was engineered on top of an intelligence advantage already gained through code breaking. Allied planners, armed with decrypted German communications, monitored every defensive assumption made by the Wehrmacht. They knew which sectors were reinforced, which commanders were confident, which regions were dismissed as unlikely targets. The famous deception operation, later known as Fortitude, did not exist in a vacuum. It was guided and validated continuously by reading German reactions in real time. When false units were deployed on paper, German intercepts confirmed belief. When traffic concentrated around the Pas de Calais, Allied confidence hardened. Every German reinforcement sent to the wrong place was acknowledged silently in intelligence summaries long before it appeared on situation maps. On the German side, reports arriving before June 1944 revealed a troubling pattern. Reconnaissance noted increased Allied activity everywhere and nowhere specific. Commanders argued. Some warned Normandy was vulnerable. Others insisted the main blow would still fall at Calais. What none of them knew was that Allied planners already understood every argument. As it occurred, on June 5, 1944, German headquarters received routine weather assessments. Intercepted Allied signals suggested nothing definitive. The English Channel appeared unfavorable. No alarms were raised. Enigma traffic continued unrestrained. By the early hours of June 6, radios crackled with confusion. Encrypted requests for clarification poured in as airborne reports contradicted expectations. German units signaled sightings of parachutes. Requests for authorization to move armored reserves stalled in bureaucratic channels, now delayed by uncertainty rather than secrecy. Allied intelligence had not simply predicted German reactions. It had forecast their hesitation. As the invasion unfolded, German commanders watched carefully planned defenses dissolve under forces that seemed to anticipate counterattacks before they occurred. Communications ordered, repositioning only to discover Allied units already there. This was the moment when suspicion hardened into shock. After action reports following Normandy increasingly referenced the enemy's extraordinary foresight, not luck, not reconnaissance alone, something deeper, something systemic. Yet even then, the conclusion remained unspoken in official German assessments, the admission that Allied forces had been reading Axis operational traffic before one of the largest military offensives in history would have shattered faith in the command system itself. Instead, commanders believed they had been outproduced, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. In truth, they had been outinformed. From that point onward, the Axis could no longer seize strategic initiative in the West. Every planned movement faced pre-existing resistance. Every attempt at surprise collapsed against prepared opposition. The invisible war, silent, methodical, relentless, had reached its decisive outcome. And as German command struggled to reconstruct meaning from failure, the consequences of this exposure began spreading far beyond the battlefield. shaping the war's final phase. The immediate aftermath of exposed Axis planning was not marked by public acknowledgement, but by quiet imbalance. Allied casualty reports began showing an absence as much as a presence. Convoys arrived untouched. Divisions met resistance that was fierce but anticipated. Battles occurred on ground chosen in advance. Operational risk was still immense, yet uncertainty diminished. Commanders could plan with confidence measured not in optimism, but in encrypted confirmation. Nowhere was this clearer than at sea. By late 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic, once Germany's strongest strategic lever, had effectively been decided. U-boat operations continued, but without momentum. Intercepted traffic revealed increasingly cautious orders. Patrol durations shortened. Commanders reported fear of sudden air attacks even in previously safe waters. German naval logs recorded loss after loss, often without contact reports. Submarines vanished between check-ins. The mystery did not end with the war, but its impact was immediate. German shipping capacity collapsed. Fuel shortages worsened across every front. The industrial effort strained under material absence rather than Allied firepower alone. On land, intelligence dominance reshaped how campaigns unfolded. During the Allied advance across France, German counterattacks often met prepared defenses. Reinforcements moved under constant air pressure guided by predicted routes. Even when German units retained combat effectiveness, they lacked freedom of maneuver. Every message coordinating movement filled Allied folders before orders reached field headquarters. Yet documentation of this imbalance remained extraordinarily limited. Ultra and magic limitations ensured intelligence affected decisions without appearing to do so. Victory reports credited air superiority, numerical strength, or leadership. Casualty ratios quietly reflected something else: knowledge applied with restraint. German prisoners, when interrogated, frequently expressed disbelief. Allied responses during battles seemed synchronized to measured. They described an enemy who never appeared indecisive, not reckless, not panicked, simply informed. At the strategic level, German leadership attempted post hoc explanations. Production shortfalls, Allied bombing campaigns, poor weather, any variable that did not threaten core doctrine. No widespread purge of communications occurred. Enigma remained in service until the war's final days, even as defeat became inevitable. German commanders continued transmitting operational detail, often knowing it was risky, but lacking alternatives. Modern warfare without radio coordination was unthinkable. Control required communication, and communication remained fatally compromised. Meanwhile, the very existence of American code-breaking stayed hidden. It did not appear in victory speeches. It did not shape headlines. Analysts returned to anonymity. Some were sworn to silence for decades. Others took their knowledge into civilian life, where it could not be acknowledged or explained. As a result, the war appeared from the outside to have been decided primarily by production capacity and battlefield courage. Both mattered enormously, but underneath that visible struggle lay a silent advantage that altered outcomes before men ever met. And as weapons fell quiet in Europe, the implications of this intelligence victory began to surface, not publicly, but in how future wars would be conceived, and how secrecy itself would be redefined. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers moved quickly, not to celebrate, but to erase footprints. Documents were sealed, facilities dismantled, machines destroyed or quietly archived. The full scale of wartime code-breaking remained classified, not just from the public, but from many of the officers whose decisions had unknowingly relied on it. Even among the victors, knowledge was compartmentalized. The secrecy was deliberate. Revealing how thoroughly Axis plans had been exposed would have undermined post-war diplomacy, endangered intelligence methods, and perhaps most critically shattered the illusion that modern encryption could protect a nation's intentions. Absolutely. In a world entering a new era of global tension, that illusion was still useful for the German side. The truth emerged slowly and incompletely. Interrogations of senior officers revealed lingering disbelief. Some insisted their ciphers had never been compromised in any meaningful way. Others acknowledged security failures but assumed limited breaches. Few grasped the continuity of Allied access, the fact that operational intentions had been visible for sustained stretches of the war. When fragments of the truth surfaced decades later, they carried quiet devastation. German commanders rereading their own wartime decisions now understood why finds had failed, why attackers met resistance too perfectly shaped to chance. The enemy had not merely reacted well, it had been reading them as they wrote. Militaries worldwide took note. Post-war doctrine shifted emphasis from hardware to information. Secure communication became a strategic pillar rather than a technical concern. Intelligence agencies expanded permanently. Code breaking and encryption evolved into daily contest. No longer auxiliary but central to national survival, the human cost remained incalculable. Every convoy saved also meant another convoy destroyed elsewhere. Every ambush avoided forced combat into different locations. Intelligence did not eliminate violence. It reshaped it. Those who benefited rarely saw the price paid elsewhere. What endured beyond 1945 was the lesson that wars are not decided solely by who fights harder or even who builds more, but by who understands first. Germany had trusted secrecy as an assumption. The United States had treated it as a question. That difference echoed far beyond the ruins of Europe, into every conflict that followed. And in that echo lies the final meaning of the moment when German commanders realized too late that their war plans had been exposed long before. The battles they were meant to win. History often remembers wars through images of fire and motion, columns of tanks, waves of aircraft, cities reduced to ash. But the Second World War was also decided in rooms where nothing moved at all. The moment German commanders sensed their plans were no longer their own, did not arrive with a single revelation. It emerged gradually, through patterns that refused to break, through defeats that felt prearranged, through an enemy that seemed less reactive than prepared. What stunned the Axis was not merely that their codes had been broken, but that warfare itself had shifted beneath their feet for centuries. Secrecy had meant silence, messages delivered by trusted hands, plans guarded by physical distance. In the 20th century, secrecy depended on machines and mathematics. Germany trusted both. What it failed to account for was the human capacity to adapt, to industrialize thought, and to merge intellect with scale. American codebreakers did not win battles in the traditional sense. They bent probabilities. They narrowed uncertainty. They allowed commanders to choose where to fight and where not to. Many lives were saved without anyone knowing why. Others were lost in places never meant to bear that weight. The war exposed a truth that still governs conflict today. Power no longer lies only in force. It lies in foresight. Every modern military traces part of its doctrine to this invisible struggle. Every secure network is built with its lessons in mind. And every assumption of secrecy now carries doubt where confidence once stood. German commanders were stunned not because defeat came, but because it arrived from a direction they never believed existed. In the end, the war was not just fought on land, sea, and air. It was fought in knowledge. And that battlefield, once revealed, never closed again.